I would be absolutely surprised if you told me, 6 months ago that Berlin would be comfortable with having there be German vehicles rolling around in Russia, right? Like that seemed something that's like utterly impossible, but here we are now. So I do hope we continue leaning into this, because if the alliance supporting Ukraine leans into actually taking the fight to Russia, and getting decisive about removing all the safety nets, removing all the luxuries that we have provided the Russians so far in this war, then the Russians, I think, will not win.
I suppose one of the biggest questions at the moment, George, is for how long can Ukraine hold the territory it's captured in Russia? What is your sense on that?
I think it fully depends on the Russian response. So if the Russians send only, you know, conscript units, FSB border guards, Russian National Guard units, and other various cobbled together cats and dogs under a dubious joint command in an ineffective way, I think the Ukrainians have a decent chance of being able to dig in and stay in. I'd also note that there was a HIMARS strike, long-range rocket artillery strike, that struck a Russian convoy that was moving in the direction of Kursk back on August 9th. So it seems that the Ukrainians are able to use some long-range fires to support their forces as well, which is good for their ability to defend what they have. I don't think the Ukrainian objective is to hold a whole lot of territory, but fundamentally, unless the Russians really do redeploy a large amount of combat power, like frontline units, to push them out, then I think the Ukrainians can find a situation where it's not going to be terribly costly to hold their positions. And I'd add that, like I said, even if the Ukrainians are forced to pull out a little bit and they lose a lot of what we currently see on the map, that's not a bad thing. If it comes at the trade-off of now the Russians actually have to divert a substantial amount of their combat power and forces to now defend an extra 1,000 kilometers worth of border that they essentially get for free now. That would be a preferable trade, in fact.
Are you clear what the primary objective of this incursion is? I mean, is it to divert troops and to make Russia position troops along the border and away from the front line? Or is it just to regain the initiative and boost Ukrainian morale? Is it to send a political message to Putin? Is it a mixture of all three?
Yeah, candidly, I'm not going to speculate on what the Ukrainian objective might be here. The Ukrainians have achieved operational and tactical surprise. Nobody, unless they have access to the Ukrainian command, actually knows what their objectives are. I'm not going to pretend to know them. There's a lot of positive things and a lot of dilemmas that the Ukrainians are imposing on the Russians with this campaign, many of which I'm confident are not the main objective. So you can advance multiple lines of effort through one offensive operation. There's a lot of good things. I'm not sure which is the main, and even if I did, I wouldn't want to share it, because I'd like to think that the Kremlin would continue to put forward ineffective responses as opposed to getting sure on really effective responses.
Some people have suggested that Ukraine may be trying to take the nuclear power station in Kursk. Is that realistic?
I'm not sure on what basis that's being argued, to be honest. If the Ukrainians continue advancing, and by the way, the rate of Ukrainian advance has slowed down over the last 72 hours, so ceteris paribus, I'm skeptical of the Ukrainians to be able to seize that, but who knows? Maybe they will. I don't think that would be an intrinsic objective, because I'm not exactly sure what that gets the Ukrainians. I think in terms of the kinds of operational effects you would seek to achieve, it's more important to do some of the things we talked about, increasing the costs for the Russians, demonstrating to Western powers that you can conduct operations against on Russian soil against the Russians. It does not result with massive Russian retaliation, and hopefully changing the Kremlin's, invalidating the Kremlin's planning assumptions about what it does and doesn't need to prosecute this war. But we'll see.
And just to inject a note of caution on the Ukrainian side of things, it was interesting you mentioned earlier, George, that you need, broadly speaking, 3 times as many troops when you're on the offense compared to when you're defending. And we've spoken about the issues with manpower that Ukraine has had anyway. If it sustained significant casualties with this incursion, what could the long-term consequences of that be for Kyiv?
Yeah, that's the big risk, right? Like as we speak, as the Ukrainians make gains in the north near Kursk, the Russians continue to make gains in the southeast near Avdiivka and in the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russian main effort for this year. It is to be determined, right? If I think historians and analysts are going to debate for the rest of this year And I think probably for decades in the military analysis community, was it the right decision in late 2024 to conduct a major operation in Kursk and send those forces there, as opposed to sending them to the east to reinforce. I don't think it's not clear right now that there's a correct right or wrong answer, and there may not be. I mean, historians make similar debates about all kinds of decisions that military commanders have made over the course of history. Like a famous example, and since we're on the theme of Russia, I'll go back to the Napoleonic Wars, like with the Battle of Borodino, which was essentially a settlement just before the French imperial forces managed to get to Moscow. And their General Kutuzov put up a decisive defense. And at the end of the day, after a very bloody battle, it was a tactical French victory. They managed to get the Russians out of there, and the Russians retreated. But the Russians had an operational victory in that they defeated the critical mass of Napoleon's combat power, and Napoleon did not have enough combat power to finish the campaign. The Russians burned Moscow, and they fell back further, and then the winter finished the job. Historians to this day debate about a critical decision that Napoleon made during the Battle of Borodino, which was should have Napoleon essentially sent his Praetorian Guard, basically the reserve regiment that was attached with the group that's designed to protect Napoleon, into combat, and had he deployed it decisively, could he have had a better chance of better odds of not losing as many of his main force in the battle? Of course, if he was successful, then perhaps Napoleon might have had enough combat power to finish the war on French terms. If not, then not only would have he had a tactical defeat or an operational defeat at Borodino, but he wouldn't have his Imperial Guard to protect him personally and ensure that he'd be able to have personal security. So that is all to say, we shall see.
I wanted to ask you about the international response, because this is really interesting. President Biden has said he's been in contact with Kyiv constantly over the last 7 days, although the White House has stressed it's not been engaged in any aspect of the planning or preparation. Obviously, there is speculation as to the risk of escalation here if it's seen to be a Western-endorsed incursion. What do you read into the response from Ukraine's Western allies so far?
I don't know anything concretely, but my sense is that the White House was caught by surprise by this campaign. Because I recall it was either a White House or a Department of Defense spokesperson in the first day or two of the operation, essentially stating that they reached out to Kyiv for clarification for what's going on, which indicated to me that I think they were not expecting this campaign. And that is very interesting. And all the reports that we've seen surface since then suggest that, the Ukrainians held very close to their chest their plans for this campaign, this operation, which, honestly, good for them. Good for them. We know that there's been a propensity for, elements of the U.S. government to, out of risk of, escalation with Russia, to share details with the Russians. And we also know, of course, the United States government, we have our own leaks. Like, our officials talk to media. Our National Guardsmen leak classified information, right? I mean, that was a big scandal last year ahead of the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive. And it's these sort of, loose lips that sink ships and that remove the ability for Ukraine to achieve, even on a near transparent battlefield due to, all the drones and fabulous intelligence that exists out there, operational surprise. So, it's very interesting to see that basically after the Ukrainians conducted the operation, they got a ex post facto endorsement and support. We have subsequently seen, HIMARS strikes, at least what seems to be a probable HIMARS strike within Russia. And the European states, Washington aside, the European states seem to be leaning into this as well. So I would be absolutely surprised if you told me, 6 months ago that Berlin would be comfortable with having there be German vehicles rolling around in Russia, right? Like that seemed something that's like utterly impossible, but here we are now. So I do hope we continue leaning into this, because if the alliance supporting Ukraine leans into actually taking the fight to Russia, and getting decisive about removing all the safety nets, removing all the luxuries that we have provided the Russians so far in this war, then the Russians, I think, will not win.